it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Shanedra Nowell. Dr. Nowell is an associate professor of social studies education at Oklahoma State University. She taught middle and high school social studies and journalism courses before moving into higher education. As part of her work at Oklahoma State, she directs the secondary education program and serves as director of the Oklahoma State University Writing Project. Her research interests include social studies education, Holocaust education, media literacy education, content area writing, and place-based education. Her publications include research on the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot, which we'll hear more about today, digital and media literacy, social media and education, and Common Core literacies in social studies. So I thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm going to hand the stage over to you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. I'm a teacher, so I brought slides. So that's just how I roll. So thank you for having me. Yes, I'm Dr. Shanedra Nowell from Oklahoma State University. I am director of our local Oklahoma State University Writing Project. And I'm going to share with you some of the work that our writing project, myself, kind of before I became director of the writing project, this has been a passion of mine. This topic has been a passion of mine for quite some time. But I want to share with you some of the work that our writing project has done recently around basically teaching this topic and making sure, especially Oklahoma educators and K-12 students in the state of Oklahoma are familiar with the Tulsa Race Massacre. Because as I talk about this here, it was probably, and most people tell you, it was probably the late 80s, early 90s in Oklahoma before the topic of the Tulsa Race Massacre was spoken about widespread. Like, people did not talk about this. We talked about there being a culture of silence around this event. And there were lots of reasons for this. As you go into the research and talk to community members, whites didn't talk about it because they were afraid of being blamed for the event, and African Americans didn't talk about it because they were afraid of it happening again. It was talked about it within the African American community and passed down through oral histories and stories, but it wasn't taught about in schools. And even to this day, I teach college, mostly those who are preparing to become teachers. And so we talk about teaching this event, and I asked them, before you set foot on this campus, how many of you, had learned about this event in school? It might be anywhere from 15 to 30%, even in 2021. And so teaching this event has been really a passion of mine, probably since I became a teacher, but it's something that I've spent a lot of time and research on. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Race Massacre today and then kind of share some things about what we're doing. But this happened in June of 1921, basically the end of May to June 1st, kind of May 30th to June 1st, 1921. And of course, they were able to destroy this African American community. We are coming up on a century later. On the anniversary, we're not calling it a celebration, it's a commemoration in Tulsa. With the pandemic, I think a lot of the planning around what we exactly, want to do as a community, it's been slow going, and there are actually a lot of different groups working on different events. But myself working with the Oklahoma State University Writing Project and working at Oklahoma State University, Tulsa is actually on the site of the Tulsa Race Massacre. It's actually in Greenwood. And so they've actually done a lot of work over the last few years to make this a priority and making sure that they're sharing this knowledge with the community. But again, I've worked a lot with Oklahoma teachers and Oklahoma students, really getting them to not only understand the past, but again, how does basically what we learned about this event in the past, how is it really changing our thinking of what we want our community to be in the future? So Greenwood in 1921 was again the site of the Race Massacre. This was a African American community in basically North Tulsa. It was a prosperous community. Oklahoma's first law was segregation. Because of that. And Oklahoma didn't become a state until 1907. So we're kind of a young state. I'm from the East Coast. I forgot to mention that. I'm actually from North Carolina originally. I have family in Baltimore. So I feel like I have connections here. And I've actually enjoyed the conference today and learning about the work that you all are doing. But this community in Tulsa, I don't know if you know much about the state of Oklahoma itself. You know, it was, Indian country, or it was going to be, the state where we basically, sent all the Native Americans that were forcibly removed from all over the country, not even just the Southeast, but all over the country were sent to Oklahoma. So let's make it an Indian state. And then for a little rumblings kind of after the Civil War, let's make it a Black state. So there actually was kind of a move to make it, a Black state where, freedmen could go. And then all that kind of got washed away with the land opening. Let's take the land away from the Native Americans. Let's get rid of the idea that we would even want to welcome African Americans here. And let's make it pretty much a white state. So that was actually Oklahoma's first law in 1907 was segregation. But because of that, and especially with the discovery of oil in Oklahoma in the early 1900s, all that money was basically being poured into Tulsa, which was the oil capital of the world at the time, and it flowed into the Black community. But because they couldn't spend it in the white community, that money stayed in Greenwood. They talk about, the dollar would turn over like 7 to 10 times, in Greenwood. People had nice houses, they had, just everything that you would want thinking about this time in 1920. And that became, a sign of envy for the white community. You would see in the newspaper at the time and talk about, this part of Tulsa as, I could name all sorts of names, but Little Africa, I'll go with that one. And they didn't mean that in a good way. But there was just a lot of animosity between the two groups. And this came to a head, of course, in what happened in 1921. I think talking about Black Wall Street, and this is just a mural that you can find today in Tulsa's Greenwood district, was really important in teaching this event, because we find that especially our African-American students, they might have heard about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and every time, I'm a history teacher, I'm a social studies teacher, every time you come across, African-Americans in a textbook, it's kind of like oppression. But teaching about Black Wall Street, we found, is really kind of erasing that oppression. Like, this was something that African Americans, should be proud of, this prosperous community, especially during this period of time. I'm going to kind of walk through what I call like one story of the riot or race massacre, and I'll talk about a little bit of that change of language. Of course, this was called the Tulsa Race Riot for many different years, and in the last probably 3 to 4 years, we've kind of transitioned to the language we call it the Tulsa Race Massacre, to again put that focus on this was done to this community. And we think about riot, like these people weren't rioting in the community. Basically, the white community came into this community and destroyed it. We wanted to make that clear in the language. And that's when I talk with students, I have this discussion of, should we call it a riot or a massacre? And make, a sort of correlation to Boston Massacre, like how many people died in that massacre? Yeah, it's always an interesting discussion with the students. But this kind of comes to a head with what I like to call the elevator incident. I know Carol earlier was like, talk about that. So this happened between Dick Rowland, who was a young shoe shiner, who, again, you think about all that being a menial job, but he actually had money. There was rumor that he had a diamond belt buckle. I don't know if that's true or not, but he was making a lot of money as a shoe shiner because he was shining the shoes of oilmen, and they're giving him big tips because there's a lot of money in Tulsa at the time. And Sarah Page, who is a 17-year-old elevator operator, who was also a divorcee at 17. I always think that's a really interesting thing. We don't really know what happened in the elevator. We just know that she screamed and he ran from the building. But questions still remain about the relationship. So there are people in Greenwood who will tell you, like, it was passed down through their family that Dick and Sarah were a couple. They were having some type of quarrel. We definitely would have known they would have known each other because this was the one place in Tulsa that Dick Rowland was allowed to use the restroom. And so he would have been going up and down this elevator quite a bit. So we knew that they knew each other. Again, we don't really know what happened. Of course, it's published in the media. There was an article published about the incident, and basically, you know, a Black man attacked a white woman. Sounds very familiar. The next day, Dick Rowland was arrested and held in downtown. The local sheriff actually did all he could to protect him. There have been lots of lynchings in Tulsa and even in the state of Oklahoma. I think the numbers, you know, are in the hundreds, and they actually lynch white people in Tulsa. There was a story, I guess, the year before of a white man being lynched for stealing a car. And even to this day, I don't know if you're familiar with Oklahoma, I feel like there's a level of lawlessness around here, you know, like you can't tell us what to do. That still goes on in Oklahoma to today. Let's see. Yeah, so there was the African American community. One of the pillars of that community was A.J. Smitherman. He owned the Black newspaper in Tulsa, the Tulsa Star. He heard about what went on. He wanted to prevent, of course, the lynching of Dick Rowland. He actually got some of his guys together who were mostly World War I vets, and I think this time period is really important to talk about this kind of first push for equal rights that happened after World War I, after the soldiers returned from Europe. But when he goes to the sheriff turns him down. You know, we don't need your help. I think we have a discussion with students about like what were the reasonings behind that. We do know in the paper that evening, there was apparently an article that was published calling for the lynching of Dick Rowland. It was very inflammatory, but we actually don't have a copy of the article because if you look in the archives, it's actually been cut out of the archives, which is another piece of the story that's really intriguing. And I like to have conversations about the role of the press in this incident. So later that evening, after the Evening Tribune came out, they're basically whites, you know, gathered in downtown Tulsa. They surrounded the courthouse, wanted Dick Rowland release. Blacks heard about it. They came back to the courthouse to, you know, make sure that didn't happen. Altercations ensued. We know a gunshot went off. Someone got shot. And this is basically when the full-scale riot began. You'll notice here, and I, you know, apologize for some of the images that are pretty brutal when we have a conversation about, you know, what images we want to share with students. But there were hundreds of images taken during the Tulsa Race Massacre, and most of them were not taken to, you know, catalog this event like, oh, this is happening. Let me take that. Some of these images were turned into postcards after the event to say that they were proud of what they had done. Look, we destroyed this community, and yeah, that's a whole other conversation as well. We know about 10,000 whites invaded Greenwood, systematically looting and burning businesses. You were lucky that night someone told you what was happening. You were able to flee your home before you were forced out at gunpoint. African Americans were rounded up and taken to holding or internment centers in Tulsa and were not released until a white person came to vouch for them. This goes on all night long, this burning and destroying of this neighborhood in Tulsa, until basically state troopers arrived from Oklahoma City, which is about 100 miles away from Tulsa. And I actually have recently seen the copy of the telegram that was sent from Tulsa to Oklahoma City asking for help about what was going on. But after all this, we don't know the exact numbers of the dead, and there are searches to this day. We're actually in the middle of a mass grave search in Tulsa that it's taken almost 100 years for that to happen because of pushback from the community, and them not wanting to search for these mass graves, but they think they just recently found one right before Christmas. They found it. They basically had to cover it back up, and they're going to come back in the spring to figure out exactly what they have discovered. But we know there were about 10,000 homeless, because this community was pretty much burned to the ground. But I think another important part, I think, you know, teaching what Greenwood was before, teaching about the event, and then thinking about the resilience of this community and Greenwood being rebuilt is very important. It still stands today. It's a place that you can visit. And there are lots of, you know, markers for, you know, commemoration and moves for reconciliation within the community. So desegregation actually kind of led to the demise of Greenwood, and the fact that, and I chose this image here because you can actually see the highway that they built in the middle of the Greenwood district in the 1970s, which actually kind of put the final stamp, but it is actually coming back today with a lot of local investment. And one of the places within Greenwood that is probably one of the most powerful places I will say I've ever been is the John Hope Franklin Park, Reconciliation Park. So the John Hope Franklin Center is a group that has work is actually named after John Hope Franklin, who, you know, is Americans, one of our great historians, especially African-American history, which we call American history. He is the son of B.C. Franklin, who was present during the race massacre in Greenwood. He was a local lawyer. And after this event took place, the city actually moved immediately to, you know, basically prevent African Americans from moving back into Greenwood. Basically said no houses could be built out of wood ever again because they're going to burn them down. Yeah, so B.C. Franklin, or Buck Franklin, actually did a lot to make sure that African Americans were able to retain their rights and their property, things like that. And so John Hope Franklin grew up, you know, in this community with this history, and you know, his work and his memory is preserved in this park. I'll click this here, and I think I actually have this open already. And I'll send a link to this presentation here in a minute. But one of the places, if you're not able to come to Tulsa, you can actually tour Greenwood. Here, looking at this is the park that you can go to. You can see the monuments that are in the park. Let's see, I'll just go here, Hope Plaza, and gives you a little bit about, you know, Dwight, oh my gosh, I forgot his last name. Oh yeah, Ed Dwight did most of these sculpture. He's an astronaut, African-American astronaut, and turned sculptor, but taking like some of these historical images and turning them into places. And then of course this Tower of Reconciliation, which is in the middle of the park here, really does kind of tell the story, and it actually tells kind of Oklahoma's and African Americans history, a lot of with Native American history kind of intertwined, and it tells a story as it goes up. And then at the end, it's kind of lifting as we climb. So they're not, you know, lifting people up as trying to get to the top, you know, which is, I think, a really powerful way to tell the story. So I'll talk a little bit about the work, and kind of let me know how I'm doing on time here.
Yeah, I do have a few questions that I'd like to ask, and we'll be jumping into Q&A momentarily, but this is great. Continue.
Okay. So when I work with, you know, schools and teachers and different groups, we kind of ask this question, like, what can we learn from the Tulsa Race Massacre and how can we apply it today? We worked I'm thinking about Oklahoma State University Writing Project has worked with a lot of different groups. Of course, we're part of the National Writing Project, but we work with a lot of, you know, local and state and national groups to kind of help and tell this history. One was Local Learning. They worked with us this past summer on presenting a teacher workshop, you know, and really working with teachers. And we'd actually held this workshop the summer before as well, and about 20 local teachers had shown up, and, you know, we walked Greenwood, and we, you know, talked about ways to teach this mostly through literature, young adult and children's literature. So this week we wanted to kind of look at it more of a place-based and look at it through oral histories and things like that. But we actually ended up, since it was virtual, you know, we ended up with 60 teachers from across the country. And that was an amazing experience that we worked out through over a week. One of the teachers was a local teacher who actually had the pleasure of teaching at Oklahoma State University, but she's a elementary teacher in Tulsa. And I think it's really important to think about even our youngest students can embrace this work and work on, you know, anti-racist, anti-bias perspectives through the teaching. And so this particular elementary teacher looked at this through art as activism, and, you know, looked at the mural and, you know, different murals in other communities. And she worked with her students with children's literature, and really asking her 4th and 5th graders really important and hard questions for them to think about, you know, what changes they wanted to see in their own community. So that's just one of the things that we've seen come out of that summer workshop. Working with a project in the National Writing Project, and we got a LRNG Innovators Grant to look at this. And so we worked with about 200 students from 8 different schools across the state of Oklahoma. We actually brought them to Greenwood, had them walk Greenwood, learn the history. They learned it through their courses, and then we had them come up with their own inquiry questions and inquiry projects. So they come up with digital stories. I'll click on this one here so you can see a little bit of it. I think this one you just click through. But yeah, you can see how the students, this is a student telling the story of the race massacre and showing what they've learned. about this event. So it's really been interesting. And I'll share some of the student work here. We work with the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation. Specifically, we have them actually lead our tours through Greenwood. So this is actually, the corner of Black Wall Street. This is still what we call Deep Greenwood, where most of the buildings were destroyed, but we actually have some of the facades were put together from some of the old bricks from the buildings that were destroyed in the 1921. But taking students to this community, having them ask their own questions, taking to the Reconciliation Park, having them journal and figure out again what questions that they're asking. And then we see the students' responses to that. So I'll just click through a few of these here. This is a student in Tulsa. She gives a little talk here, and let's see, I don't know if it'll play.
The Tulsa Race Massacre occurred on May 31st, 1921.
She's really quiet, so I'll keep playing. I'll pass her here, but she, basically I pulled this quote from her this is kind of a TED talk. We called them LRNG talks, but I wanted to learn from the past so that we don't make the same mistakes in the future. And this is a 7th grader really thinking about what this history may mean for them. We had students build what we call Google.
Sorry. Ask one question because we've got some questions coming in based on what you're talking about now.
Okay, go
ahead. The one question is, first of all, how long was the process to establish that Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park? And you've talked about some of the lessons learned. And additionally, from an educational perspective, have you partnered with, have you partnered with the National Education Association and national offices to push this important agenda in all schools? Or is this something that's sort of a coalition of the willing, of those who are willing to teach this in their curriculum, in their classrooms?
Okay. So for your first question about the Reconciliation Park, I actually I affiliate with this group, John Hope Franklin, but I actually not, on their board or director of operations or anything. I would say it probably took them maybe 5 to 10 years to, get this done. I'd have to reach out to them and figure out exactly what that timeline was like. So I don't know the answer to that question. As for the curriculum and really think about this, so I was on the committee that rewrote, our social studies curriculum within the state of Oklahoma recently. And I will say teaching this topic has actually been in the standards since 2001. But again, like I said, it's still not being taught. And what I've found out from my end is that teachers aren't teaching it because they didn't know the history. Like they were never taught the history. Even if you open Oklahoma history textbook, there might be a paragraph about it. Like they just didn't have access to information. So that's been part of my work, is making sure that they have access to that information. With our rewriting of standards, I think they came out in 2019. There is now kind of a wealth of information. We've put together lots of resources for teachers in the state. So I feel like now teachers can't say I don't teach this because I don't know it. The information is there. Last time that we had a state conference, then we talked about this, that we had, I actually gave a session and there was standing room only in the room because teachers were like, I need to know this information so I can teach it. So I think on the state level, there is definitely a major push now to teach it. Nationally, the state of Oklahoma is one of those states where local control is huge. And so as much as we like to push, like here are state standards, local districts do decide what they want to teach and not teach. So I still have this fear that it's not being taught as much as I would like to. And then think about national standards. Something else that hasn't quite been embraced by our very young state. Did that answer your question?
It does. And I have a question from a different perspective, but it's from the perspective of community engagement and stakeholder engagement, because you're very actively involved from the academic perspective and the education perspective. But who are the stakeholders at the table who are a part of these truth and reconciliation efforts, and are descendants of those who were victims of the massacre or who participated in the offense? Are they a part of your community?
I would say definitely yes. There are lots of, and this thing about this topic, there are lots of groups. There is a commission that was actually put together by the state and by local community groups where basically they invited everyone to the table. So the 1921 Race Massacre Commission is probably like the #1 group. And that's the group that say OSU, Tulsa, and Oklahoma State University, plus the Greenwood Cultural Center, local churches, the Chamber of Commerce in Greenwood, and just local community members are all, that group pulled that, those different stakeholders together to the table. And that's the group that's kind of driving the local commemorations of this. So that I would say that's kind of the main group. But when we think about perpetrators, I don't think, even to this day, they're not very vocal. Even having conversations about this, it's still very tough. I think about, there was a local church who, through research, people had kind of connected, like members of this church were part of the perpetrators back in 1921. So when it was brought to the church's attention, the church kicked, members who brought this up out of the church. So there's still a lot of people not willing to get to that, let's even discuss the truth before we can have a reconciliation. I still say there's a level of that in Tulsa. Even 2 years ago, I think the first teacher workshop, and it had got a lot of local attention, and there were a lot of stories posted about it. But don't ever look at the comments on social media, right? I started looking at the comments, and there were a lot of people who were like, "Why are we talking about this? It never happened." And so there's still kind of we need to work on that truth part before we can even get to the reconciliation. I think that's something that I think a lot of people are coming to terms with, especially in our current, national climate. People are willing to talk about that, but Oklahoma is a very red state. That became more red this last election, so that is, people ask why did Trump choose Tulsa for his rally over the summer? And that is one of the reasons why, because he just knew that if he came to this place, that would have been a safe place for him. Millions of people were going to show up. Of course, that didn't happen. We got a little bit of sense around here, but yeah, we're working on the truth part. We're still getting there, and that's a lot of my work. I want to get to the reconciliation. I think I'm doing that through my classroom work. That's why we're teaching teachers to teach students. So hopefully, as this next generation comes up, and that's why I think it's really interesting to share what these kids are talking about, like their experiences with this, so that we can move closer to that, getting to the reconciliation part.
And when we talk about truth, I remember in the presentation that I saw at the American Folklore Society, you mentioned the fact, something I had never realized, but you talked about the fact that because it was called a riot, it was intentional, because insurance companies were no longer obligated to compensate, pay. And I was wondering,
this is a wealthy community. They had insurance, and I think the total at the time is like over $2 million of insurance claims were denied.
So are there any talks when we talk about truth about reparations?
Yes, there are a lot of talks about reparations. In the 1990s, when the first kind of report about this came out, one of the things they actually recommended was reparations. There hasn't been much work towards that, because as you can imagine, anytime you mention reparations, especially the white community, is like, whoa, we can't talk about this. But I think it's becoming more and more important. I think there's been talk of maybe offering scholarships or maybe just investment into the community as reparations. But yeah, I'd say it's being discussed. It's a hard discussion.
And so we do have to move on to the next part of the agenda, but I just wanted to ask one final question. We've got folks asking, can the resources that you've put together for Oklahoma teachers be used externally for other states' curriculum, or is there access to some of your workshop materials, or do you still provide workshops where people can participate in teaching difficult histories?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I will share here in just a second. I'll drop it into the chat, the link to the presentation, links to, we've put together kind of shared resource kind of folders and documents. I'll share that as well. We were thinking about doing a workshop this summer. My summer is looking crazy as now. The only workshop I planned to offer this summer, particularly on this topic, is that one of our other partnerships is a group out of New York looking at the Holocaust, and so we're actually going to do a workshop looking at the Holocaust. To compare, we don't compare anything to the Holocaust, and we don't want to do that, but looking at basically the lessons can be learned from this, looking at, anti-racist education, anti-bias education, looking again for truth and reconciliation, that type of thing, and how its teachers can look at that. So that is a workshop that we're offering this summer in June. As of now, it's supposed to be face-to-face, but we may or may not be offering any other digital or virtual workshops this summer. I'm not real sure at the moment. We would love to, because it's 2021 and it's 100 years later, but looking at scheduling at the moment looks a little crazy. So yeah, I will share resources here in a second in the chat.
Thank you so much. And I greatly appreciate your sharing your wisdom and your knowledge, and also giving us some insights about how we can, moving forward, engage with multiple stakeholders and also incorporate this into our educational system. So I thank you so much for your participation, and we may be tapping on your shoulder in the future as well. So I'm glad you told us you have Baltimore roots, because now we can claim you as a Muslim.
Thank you.
And I'm going to pass this to Amy Millen, and she's going to take us into the next part of the agenda.
Great. Thank you, Carol. And welcome again to everybody, both to our continuing coalition members as well as our first-time attendees. My name is Amy Millen, as Carol just said, and I'm one of the co-leaders of the Baltimore County Coalition. So we're now going to transition to a brief sort of business meeting update on some of the work that the coalition is currently engaged in the months ahead. I would like to really, great excitement to report that plans for the April 17th marker installation are progressing. We're hoping to offer the ceremony in both a live format as well as virtual format, so that we can be flexible based on the health situation. Specific details are continuing to be worked out, but the ceremony is currently expected to begin mid-morning and include a combination of both speakers and music. If you're interested in supporting this important event, you can contact the Baltimore County Coalition at the email that I am about to put into the chat right now. It should be there. And our next planning meeting will be scheduled in February, so just a couple of weeks. We'll announce that shortly. In combination with the marker ceremony will be an essay contest titled the Racial Justice Essay Contest, and that's being led by one of our coalition members, John Billingsley, and it's going to be launched in mid-February. It'll be open for a few month or so, so it'll close at the end of March. Again, that information will be posted on our website as well as sent out in newsletters. This contest is run in partnership with Equal Justice Initiative. It's open to 9th through 12th grade students who are attending public high schools in Baltimore County. And students will be asked generally to examine the history of a topic of racial injustice and to discuss its legacy today. Recognition of the top essays are going to be announced at the April 17th event, and the top essay winner is going to be invited to read their essay as part of the marker ceremony. I had the pleasure of watching a video of the Anne Arundel County marker ceremony, and the essay contest winner reading was one of the highlights for me in that event. And Troy, I believe that you are going to give us an update on the Truth and Reconciliation Park idea.
Yes, good morning, everybody. And let me just real quickly say thank you to our speakers, Dr. Chavis and Dr. Nowell. I thought those were fantastic presentations. And Dr. Nowell, you actually queued me up really well for what I want to talk about right now, because much like Tulsa has a John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park, I think our discussion and the vision has been for us to have a Truth and Reconciliation Park here in Towson. Kind of as the next step after the installation of the marker. And so as a coalition, what we've prepared ourselves to do is to draft a proposal that kind of outlines what that park will look like. We do have a designated site that we are targeting for the park. So it is directly, well, kind of catacorn, almost directly across the street from the old Towson jail, where people can do much of the work that Dr. Nowell talked about, some of the journaling, the reflection, and garner some additional information about the contribution that African Americans have made here in the county, as well as, you know, highlight the tragedy that occurred with respect to Howard Cooper. So the administration is really committed to the idea, really committed to pursuing it. And they are asking for the coalition to put together a proposal that outlines what that park may look like. And so we are having our first convening of a subcommittee of the coalition to really focus on the creation of the proposal. And so on January 30th, next Saturday, I'm going to convene that subcommittee. And if you are interested in participating, Amy, I'm going to ask them to send an email to the County Coalition website, and then we will make sure that we send out a group invite to everyone that wants to be a part of that proposal development process. The goal ultimately is to have a proposal submitted to the administration that is agreed upon, and then that we can announce on April 17th as kind of the next step in some of the truth and reconciliation work that is going to occur here in the county. So I think it's incredibly important for us to have a place where we can convene, acknowledge these difficult truths, reconcile those truths, and then have a place of convening and healing for the community. So with that, I'm excited about the work and looking forward to anybody that wants to participate on next Saturday.
Thank you very much, Troy and Amy. So I did want to mention just these are some of the things that Carol had talked about earlier, but these are some of our ongoing community engagement efforts. You know, we have a really good, by the way, our next First Thursday film group is going to be on February 4th, and we're going to be looking at Wilmington on Fire, which is a documentary that was produced about the 1898 coup, successful coup in Wilmington and the race massacre that followed. We're going to be joined by the director of the film, as well as two of the principals who appeared in it. So, you know, it's on our website, and it was in our newsletter. So I would urge you to take a look at that, because I think that's going to be a pretty interesting discussion. We also have the ongoing work with the Baltimore County Public Library. Our research work, we are working very closely with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that will be a large part of our work this year, is getting ready for the public hearing that will be happening. So we need help with that. The Oral History Project, Carol mentioned earlier, and we're also involved in you know, our advocacy work. We had the Take a Knee initiative in May, and then I talked about Red Maple Place, and I'd like to ask, actually, and by the way, before I go any further, if you are interested in getting on our listserv or in being a part of any of these programs, I believe Amy already put the address, the email address in the chat. This is the same one up there, and please get in touch, because we, you know, justice does not come down, it does not trickle down, it percolates up. And so we need your help. We welcome your participation. And so please contact us. And I did want to ask real quickly, I'm going to also in a moment put an address. It's really long, which is why I didn't bother typing it. So I'm going to leave this up. This is, if you're interested in being a part of attending the hearing that's going to be happening on Wednesday about Red Maple Place in Towson. And is Nancy Goldring around? I would love for Nancy to talk a little bit. Nancy is the president of the historic East Towson Improvement Association, and she's been instrumental in the battle to save the community. And she's, are you here, Nance?
Yes.
Okay, good. Whoops. If you could just talk a little bit about that coming up, that would.
Oh, wait a minute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. I'm sorry, I had too many things going Thank you, Will. Thank you for, hello, everybody, and congratulations on this incredibly enlightening event. I really am grateful to be here this morning. And I've learned so much that I feel can help us in our challenges with Red Maple Place. It is a 56 unit apartment development it planned for historic East Towson. And right now we are in what we believe will be our final day of administrative law judge hearings on the afternoon, 1:30 on January 27th. We had a powerful, speaking of history, a powerful testimony by Dr. Collins from Towson University at our last hearing, and we are hopeful that that we prevail. Let's put it that way. And while we are told that even if we are victorious, there will be an appeals process that the developer will appeal. If they're successful, we will appeal. But our aim is to have the community preserved as just as well as the Hampton Mansion where it sprang from. And certainly I feel that there's a tremendous opportunity, maybe for once, I'm not sure there's ever been an opportunity to stop an injustice like this in its tracks. And so it becomes, for me personally, for the community, and I feel for the greater community, an important opportunity to take some action. You know, the county executive mentioned the initiatives that are in place for change, and that change doesn't come overnight, and I can certainly respect that, but this is an opportunity to institute change as a thing is happening. This doesn't need to be an event in the history books, another event in history where we didn't do the right thing. I feel that Red Maple is a unique opportunity to set a precedence in Baltimore County and across the country to do the right thing, to do the thing we say we want to do in terms of racial justice and equity. So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, the time. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for standing with us as you did for two entire days, waiting to testify and testifying for us so beautifully. Thank you to all the members of this coalition who have stood with us in your various ways and who are standing with us by virtue of your participation even here. We greatly, greatly appreciate you and thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. I did want to put up a couple of dates that are coming up to make sure that everyone's aware before we go. And I did want to, you know, there's the Red Maple Place hearing is this Wednesday. And, you know, I'm not sure if we even mentioned this, but that community has borne, you know, some incursions and some insults over the years, including the BG&E substation that was placed on what used to be an old ballpark, when the road building that went through and bisected the community. So it's time for people to stand up for this community, and I hope that that as many of you as possible will show up, can show up at that hearing on Wednesday, and you'll be allowed to speak if you wish. So that would be really helpful. Again, Troy is going to hold the ceremony for the a committee meeting for the Truth and Reconciliation Park, and the marker installation planning is going to happen. Our next coalition meeting, it will be March 6th. And then of course the Howard Cooper, hopefully the Howard Cooper marker installation ceremony will be on April 17th. And again, that address up at the top there is the one to use if you want to be a part of any of this or any of our ongoing programs. That would be great. Before we do go, I do have to say, I want to mention and note that Carol Brooks, who was the force behind this coalition, is unfortunately not going to be able to maintain her, stay in the position of leadership that she has. But I want to make sure that we acknowledge the incredible contribution she made. She's handled all of the pressure, all of this work with grace and dignity, and she's been a joy to work with. And we are going to really miss Carol's leadership. And I just want to make sure that Carol knows how much we all appreciate everything that she's done. And so thank you, Carol, on behalf of everyone who's here. Is there anything else that we need to talk about here before we go? I just want to check the last messages. Nope, there we go. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here today and for putting up with the technical difficulties. I will take responsibility for that. We look forward to seeing you hopefully at our March Coalition meeting. And that's it. Thanks again, and thanks to all our speakers, of course. Thank you. Take care, everybody.